In my most recent video, I talked a little bit about the Supreme Court case for which there were oral arguments today. Well, oral arguments by the time you see this. I'm recording this on a Tuesday, oral arguments on Wednesday, April 1st. This is Trump v. Barbara, which is the case about the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. I don't have my pocket constitution in front of me, but in short, the Citizenship Clause says, this is a paraphrase, I think it's basically right, but please forgive me. All persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction therein are citizens of the United States, or something like that. Roughly something like that. And the case is likely going to hinge on this phrasing, subject to the jurisdiction. I don't go into it much in that previous video, which I think is pretty good and you should watch. But I do want to speak a little bit about the substance of this case beyond broad strokes, because the argument the Trump administration is making is nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. I mean that in a literal way. It does not make any sense. And if the Supreme Court were to embrace the administration's argument, and I have no idea if they will or not, I'm not making predictions here, I'm simply saying if they were to embrace it, it would be equivalent to throwing out the Constitution in its entirety, because the meaning is that clear. So what the Trump administration would have you believe, and what their defenders would have you believe, is that that phrasing, subject to the jurisdiction, has a highly technical meaning. They would have you believe, against a plain reading of the words, that the only way you can be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States is if your parents were subject to that jurisdiction, if they had sworn allegiance to the sovereign, meaning they had demonstrated to the country, to the government, they intend to be there for a long time through their domicile, or that in one way, shape, or form, the people of the United States had consented to your parents being there in the first place. Let's say you're a naturalized immigrant or something like that. Now, one immediate problem here, this is a huge problem, is that none of these words are in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. None of these words, not domicile, not allegiance, not consent, are in the Citizenship Clause. Not one of them can be found in the debates about the Citizenship Clause, in the legislative record about the Citizenship Clause, in the speeches, in articles produced by the people who are responsible for the Citizenship Clause. You cannot find this stuff. One would think that if subject to the jurisdiction had this technical meaning that was critical to its understanding, that someone would have written about it, but they didn't. They didn't write about it. They didn't say that. What they said instead, to almost a person, was that this is meant to apply to everyone born in the United States, except for a few broadly recognized exceptions. The children of diplomats, children born because a foreign army has taken territory, and thus that territory is not within the jurisdiction of the United States, and native tribes that are not taxed, because those native tribes had a different relationship with the US government than those that were being taxed. That's it. To a person, this is how they describe the intent of their amendment: to extend citizenship to everyone born in the United States, regardless of the circumstances of their parents. There's no mention of parents in the amendment, no mention of parents in the clause. And then when you begin to think about the administration's argument, it doesn't even make sense on its own terms. The White House agrees, at the very least, that the purpose of the Citizenship Clause was to extend citizenship to the formerly enslaved. They agree that much. Any reading on this you do, any historian that tackles this, I'll recommend Eric Foner's The Second Founding on Reconstruction, will also say that the specific purpose of the Citizenship Clause was to repudiate the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott. If your interpretation doesn't do that, it doesn't work. So let's think about it. Allegiance. The enslaved were forcibly brought here. They didn't swear allegiance to anyone. Consent. There were states that effectively outlawed the presence of free blacks in their territories. Those states did not consent to black people being there. And certainly within slave states, if you were a free black, they basically expelled you as quickly as they could if they didn't try to re-enslave you to begin with. Defenders of the administration say, oh, well, subject to the jurisdiction mean that your parents had to be under the protection of the sovereign. Black Americans were essentially outlaws under slavery. They did not have the protection of the laws. When you begin to go down the list, none of it makes sense. The only thing that makes sense is the traditional understanding. If you're born on American soil, you are an American citizen. The 14th Amendment does not preclude the government from punishing, say, the parent for breaking the law, for crossing the border, or what have you. But what it does forbid is to punish the children for a choice that wasn't theirs. What it does forbid is the government or any state from turning those children into a stateless class of people who could never enjoy the privileges of citizenship. That's what it does. It does that because Dred Scott held that there were classes of people who could never enjoy citizenship, that there were classes of people who would always be subordinate. In this amendment, this clause, if it does nothing else, it is repudiate Dred Scott. I'll say, if you look back to the late 19th century, you will find one group of people talking about the Citizenship Clause in terms of consent, in terms of allegiance, in terms of protection from the sovereign. Those people will be the opponents of the 14th. It'll be white supremacist Democrats who are enraged by birthright citizenship. It will be the people engaged in a decades-long effort to try to convince the courts to interpret it in a way that would exclude Chinese Americans, that would exclude all kinds of European immigrants, that would exclude even some Black Americans. What the Trump administration would have you believe is that the opponents of the 14th Amendment in the 1870s, in the 1880s, and the 1890s had a better understanding of what the Citizenship Clause meant than the people who wrote it. Have a better understanding of the Citizenship Clause than the abolitionists who fought for it. That's what they would have you believe. That's why I say this case will be determined not by the law or by the history or by the Constitution, but by politics. Because that's all this is, politics. The meaning is clear. If you're born here, you're a citizen. And if the court decides that that's not the case, then as far as I'm concerned, nothing that comes out of that court should be respected as law, as valid, because it isn't. If they are going to throw out the Constitution, then we ought to throw out the court.